Welcome. This is DA Sports. I'm your host, DASASIE. Thank you. This is episode 47. Now, in today's episode, we got a couple of things to get into. We got to recap some NBA news in regards to the San Antonio Spurs. Two pieces of news. Unfortunately, both of them negative if you're a San Antonio Spurs fan. Then we're going to finish this episode with my top 5 and worst 5 NBA rankings as of February 27th. So let's get into it. So to start, we are going to get into our NBA news. Now, this week's NBA news solely has to do with the San Antonio Spurs. As I mentioned in the preview, it's two pieces of news. Both of them are negative if you're a Spurs fan. So the first of which was the most recent news has to do with the coach of the San Antonio Spurs, Greg Popovich. Now, Greg Popovich, for those that don't know, had what was called a mild stroke back in November. Personally, I think a stroke is a stroke. I get that there can be more severe strokes, but nonetheless, a stroke is serious. I know whether or not you label it as mild or not. So Coach Popovich has been out. I guess he just got back to the point where he was able to come back to the facility and address the team. And it's at that point where he announced that he will be out for the rest of the season. There's some speculation that he may be out forever, that he may end up retiring. He is the oldest coach in the NBA. He is also the longest tenured coach in the NBA right now. So I could understand the thought process behind maybe this will be his green light to step away for health concerns. I believe he's like 72 or 76, somewhere in that range as far as age. So yeah, I mean, he is older and it's definitely possible. But in his statement, he said that he's taking the rest of the year off so that he can hopefully come back next year. And I think from a Spurs perspective, they don't want to move on from Popovich right now. They have assistants who are taking the role as of right now, but I think especially considering that they drafted Wembanyama this year, and the plan for Wembanyama was to get him the best coaching possible, and Popovich is obviously one of the best coaches in the league, so I think that's all a part of the Spurs plan, and I feel like they want to give Wemby some more tutelage from Popovich before he steps away. So I think if he's healthy enough to come back next year, he'll do that, and the Spurs will definitely welcome him back. Now, speaking of Wemby, he is the other part of the San Antonio Spurs news, and unfortunately, Wemby is out for the season. So he's been diagnosed with deep vein thrombosis in his right shoulder. So for those that don't understand the terminology, it basically means that he developed a blood clot in his shoulder, and it's not something that's just going to go away with like some simple blood thinning medicine and stuff like that. He's actually got to take time out for the rest of the season. It's something they have to monitor. It may require him to have surgery depending on what they believe is causing the blood clot. A lot of doctors have said that people that are really tall and lanky like that, with, in his case, a basketball player, so they develop consistent motion over their head, that it is something that happens often. It has happened to some other NBA players. Chris Bosh, it happened to, which actually essentially led to him ending his career. But it also happened to Brandon Ingram, which put him out for the rest of the season. He was able to have surgery where they removed something that was basically placing pressure on the vein, and that seemed to help the issue, and now he's been playing perfectly fine. So they're hopeful that it'll be one of those type of situations in regards to Wemby, where they can monitor it, maybe do a surgery and clear it up, and then he won't have this ongoing issue. Because it really would be sad if it ends up being a situation where it's like Chris Bosh and this is the end of his career and all he got to do was play, a year and a half when there was so much projected hype of, well, he could eventually be the best player in the entire league. I think most people would agree that he was on pace to becoming a defensive player of the year this year with his blocking totals. So we look forward to seeing Wemby get back. And like we said, hopefully he's 100% healthy by the start of next year and they figure out exactly what's causing this issue so it doesn't happen again. There were reports from doctors that said that he's lucky that they caught it as early as they did, because with these type of situations, the blood clot can migrate to other parts of the body. One, for example, is to your lungs, and if that were to happen, he would die. So it's definitely a serious issue, which is why they have pulled him out, and they want to make sure that he has all the top tier care that he can get so that they can fix it. And hopefully he's able to, have a life, and then secondarily would be to come back and be able to play basketball again. Okay, so lastly, we're going to finish this episode with my top 5 and worst 5 NBA rankings as of February 27th. Now, this means that all the games that took place on the 27th are included, and that's it. So, if you recall, the last top 5 and worst 5 was just before the All-Star break. This one is about a week or so after the All-Star break. So most teams have played about 5 or 6 games since the All-Star break. So it's a good little amount of games to assess where they are right now. So let's get into it. So starting off at number 1. Right now at number 1, I'm going to go with the Cleveland Cavaliers. Cavaliers currently have the best record in the league. They are currently 48-10, and they are tied for the longest win streak in the league right now with 8 games in a row. Surprisingly, even though they're not in his top 5, just to mention it because it's kind of shocking, the other team tied with them with the longest streak in the NBA right now is the Detroit Pistons, which is astonishing considering the fact that they were the worst team in the league last year, so kudos to them. But Cleveland does also have that 8-game win streak right now, and they definitely have to be happy about it. They, right before All-Star break, they kind of went through a rough patch. They had lost, I think, 3 to 5 games in like a short amount of time. So, there were people that were speculating like, oh, are they starting to fall off? Are they coming back to reality? But they definitely got it back together and have been winning consistently, putting themselves back on top of the ranking and showing that they deserve to be a true championship contender this year, and they're not just a fraudulent top running team at the moment. Now coming in at number 2, I have to go with the Oklahoma City Thunder. Now OKC right now is 47-11. I've been saying this essentially since the beginning of these rankings, how impressive it is that they're leading the league in point differential. Their point differential did drop a little bit from the last top 5 and worst 5 rankings, but they're still about 2 points per game difference from second place, or maybe actually it might be like 1 something because I think Cleveland's went up a little bit. But nonetheless, they're still clearly in first for point differential right now. Their average point differential is 12.6 points per game. So that means that every game they're essentially winning, they're winning by double digits and more than that. So definitely something positive for them to look forward about. And if you notice a lot of the commentary around other NBA analysts, a lot of people have finally come around and now they're believing that OKC could likely make it to the NBA championship game. Now, granted, I said this before the season started. Granted, I am a Thunder fan, so people will just say, oh, I'm just biased. But no, I also predicted that they'd have a high seed in the playoffs last year when nobody was predicting that. And I picked they'd be 4th going into the playoffs when they ended up being 1st going into the playoffs. So they've been exceeding my expectations, even though my expectations have been objective. So I'm hoping that this year is no different, even though I did pick them to win it all this year. If they try to exceed it, maybe that just means they sweep in the finals or something like that. But nonetheless, I do think that things are looking great right now for OKC. Now coming in at number 3, I got to go with the Boston Celtics. Celtics right now are 47-11. Now, they have been playing really well in their last 10 games. They are 8-2 in their last 10, which is tied for the second best record in the last 10 games. And yeah, I mean, they've been very impressive. I mean, everybody knew coming into this season, after them winning the championship last year, that they were going to be a tough out for anybody. They've consistently beat up on other top tier teams. Now, there are some other top teams that have gotten them, and they just recently, speaking of a team that's not a top team, but I just mentioned them, their most recent game was a loss to Detroit, the team that is also tied with Cleveland for the longest win streak. So, yes, they've had some losses, maybe some losses that people didn't expect going into the season, but nonetheless, they've overall been fairly consistent and putting themselves in a good position to enter the playoffs as a high seed. And with the experience that they already achieved from last season, I think they're setting up very nicely for this playoff run. And Boston fans, I'm sure, are not really worrying about the fact that they're still behind Cleveland in the rankings. Coming in at number 4, I'm going to stick with the Los Angeles Lakers. Now, the Lakers are currently 36-21, and the Lakers have been very inconsistent in a general sense. The reason why I say that is, obviously everybody knows about the huge trade they had where they brought in Luka, and they knew that with giving away Anthony Davis, they lost a lot of their size. They tried to make a trade to get another big man, but then the trade got rescinded for health issues. So they're still trying to figure it out. They had, right after the All-Star break, they lost a couple of games to some teams that they shouldn't have lost to. But since then, they have picked it up and got it together. The one concerning part is their average margin of victory, their point differential. Now, if you recall, I mentioned about OKC having the largest point differential. Obviously, the Lakers don't have the smallest point differential because their point differential is positive, where there are tons of teams that have negative point differentials. But out of these top-tier teams, they have the smallest point differential of those teams. Right now, their overall point differential on the season is 1.5, which speaks to the point that I made earlier about them being inconsistent. They lose to teams they shouldn't lose to, and then sometimes they beat teams that they're not expected to beat. And it just kind of shows they're kind of like Dr. Jekyll and Mrs. Hyde, where they are capable of being explosive and beating these top-tier teams, but they're also capable of losing to a bottom-tier team, which they've done recently. Two of their last 2 losses were both to teams that are in the bottom 5 rankings. So it's a little dicey, but overall, I do feel like they still deserve to be a top 5 ranked team because the sparks that they have shown as far as what they can do, I think do translate as we get geared up for the playoff run. And I think they're a team that ultimately other teams do not want to play against. So we'll see how it goes down the stretch. But right now, I think they're good in the number 4 spot. Then rounding out the top 5, at number 5, I'm going with the Houston Rockets. The Houston Rockets right now are 37-22. Now, Houston has been a team that most people would call a surprise team. I did predict that they would be in the playoff mix this year. They're proving me right. So, another thing that I was right about. I even mentioned it last year talking about when Ime Udoka got there, how much he had transitioned his team from a bottom feeder team to a team that was scraping to make it into the playoffs once he got his culture set in place. And this year has been more of the same because they've elevated to another level. The greatest part about their team is they have so much balance. Right now, they have 7 players on the team that are averaging double digits. And that's great because on any given night, you know that your star player might struggle a little bit. You might have somebody who's off. But knowing that you have 6 other players who are averaging double digits means that one of those other players can easily pick it up a little bit. So the person that's averaging over 20, maybe they only score 15, but that person who's averaging 12 now can get over 20. So having that balance, having that great rotation to where you can mix in different people and bring people off the bench that can still be productive, give them plenty of minutes to be to be productive and give your team a boost is huge. And I think Udoka has this team playing lights out for the most part, and they're definitely going to be a scary team come playoff time. Now to get into the worst five, starting in at 26, I got to go with the Toronto Raptors. The Raptors right now are 18-41. They have been struggling in their last 10 games. They are only 2-8 in their last 10. So definitely not what you would like to do when you're trying to position yourself to make a run at the playoffs. I think that they're likely not going to make it even to a play-in game. But obviously they're not completely eliminated yet, so they're still going to keep trying. It just doesn't look like they're headed in the right direction. So there's nothing to suggest that they're going to make it out of this bottom five for the rest of the season. Now, next at 27, I got to go with the Utah Jazz. Utah Jazz are 14-44. Now, the interesting part about Utah, now, everybody expected Utah to be in the bottom five this year, but the part that I think to me is a little surprising is they don't have a single person who's averaging over 20 points per game. Lauri Markkanen obviously is their highest scorer. I believe he's at 19. But typically speaking, if you're leading a team in scoring, your leading scorer's got to average at least 20 points. That's just kind of like a base level scoring for an actual scoring leader. It shows that they clearly are lacking firepower. I know they're one of the bottom tier teams in terms of overall scoring, and that's a product of that. So they've got a long way to go. Thankfully, I think they've been planning for the future ever since last year. So this is pretty much what I think they've been expecting the whole time, and they're not really tripping off of it. Now, next at 28 is a team in a completely different position because they are tripping off of their position. That is the Philadelphia 76ers. 76ers right now are 20-38, and they currently have the longest losing streak in the NBA. They have lost 9 straight games, which is just ridiculous. I know some of you are like, wait, Philadelphia's record is better than the other two teams I ranked above them, and that is true, but these rankings aren't stagnant. It has to do with how you are playing from week to week, and obviously since the last rankings, they haven't won a single game, and there's nothing to think that they are going to keep winning games because they just have not been able to get it done. There have been some games that they've been competitive in, but at the end of the day, you don't get any pats on the back for being competitive. It's about wins and losses, and they've been doing way more losing than winning, so they definitely deserve to be down at 28 right now. I mentioned this, I believe, in the last rankings, how if they don't make it to the playoffs this year, this is probably the most disappointing franchise of the entire year, considering all the offseason moves they made to bring in Paul George, and Embiid was playing in the Olympics, so people thought, okay, he's going to be healthy all year, but that clearly wasn't the case, and they clearly don't look like they're going to be able to make a run this year, so definitely disappointing season for them. Now coming in at number 29, I got to go with the Charlotte Hornets. The Hornets are 14-44. They are currently on a 5-game losing streak, but this 5-game losing streak has been beyond terrible. Now, keep in mind their last game that they just lost, they lost by 7 points. But do you know during this 5-game losing streak, they've lost by a total of 152 points. That's right, 152 points. That means that over that 5-game stretch, they are averaging losing by more than 30 points per game. Now keep in mind, I just said their last game they only lost by 7. But their 5-game average still equals over 30 points per game. That's terrible. Just absolutely terrible. This franchise as a whole has just been terrible. And yes, they got a star player in LaMelo Ball who's selling tickets and selling merchandise and has a cool shoe and everything, but overall, just it's awful. And there's nothing to look like it's going to change anytime soon. So they definitely deserve to be in the 29 spot. But thankfully for them, they still aren't the worst. Coming in last at number 30, of course, is the Washington Wizards. Now, Washington is currently 10-48. They got the double-digit wins. That's great. I believe they're 3-7 in their last 10. That's also great by their standards. But it's not great having the worst point differential in the entire league. And to top it off, not only do they have the worst point differential, it's worse than the best point differential. So they're losing on average their games by 12.9 points. So almost 13 points per game is their average margin of loss. As their average margin, period, including their wins. So even including their 10 wins, they're still averaging losing every game by almost 13 points per game, which is the largest differential in any direction in the entire league. So when that comes in a negative, that just further proves just how terrible you are. I've said it before, I'll say it again. This is the worst run organization in the NBA. Might be the worst run organization in all of sports. They made some trades before the trade deadline. Not really going to do anything. They're terrible. Which would really be funny is even if they finish the season with the worst record in the league and then they don't get the number 1 pick, if they don't get one of those top 3 picks and end up with the 4th pick, that would be more hilarious. And then I could see them fumbling that pick and guess what? Being right back here next season. And I wouldn't be surprised because that's just what the Wizards seem to do. But that wraps it up for this top 5 and worst 5. And it also wraps it up for this episode. I want to thank you all for tuning in. Please make sure you like and subscribe and share wherever possible. And I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Peace.